In September 1965, a nervous and skinny 11-year-old boy arrived at the gates of Audenshaw Grammar School in the suburbs of Manchester to begin an undistinguished secondary education which, thankfully for all concerned, was only to last for 5 years. It was a completely different environment to the one I'd previously felt comfortable in. From being the brightest kid at primary school, I was quickly found out to be the thickest boy in my intake. Having flourished under friendly and progressive teachers, I now found myself in a world of mortar-boarded and black-gowned masters, whose sole purpose in life seemed to be to remind me that I wasn't the centre of anyone's universe. One master was different, though, Jeff Chunky Eastwood, who ruled the woodwork room with a piece of 3x2 he called the Big Drum. In 5 years of mastering dovetailed joints and learning how to boil up old horses to make glue, I can't remember him ever using it. The implied threat was quite enough to maintain order. His other weapon of mass distraction during lulls in wood-butchering lessons was to issue the edict, "Gather round, lads," after one of us had asked him what it had been like in the war. Like most adults at that time, he'd seen active service and would go all misty-eyed at the mere mention of a Merlin engine. Of course, we thought it was just a great sky from having to plane a plank down to a matchstick, but over the years Chunky Eastwood was to have a major influence on me, not least in suggesting I should join the RAF cadet force at the school when I was old enough. Because it was then, when I attended my first summer camp with the CCF, that I realised this wasn't just a woodwork teacher. This man was an old war horse. When the work coat came off and he arrived at RAF Leaming in North Yorkshire, resplendent in full dress uniform and a chest full of medals, his war stories all took on a new meaning. Grown men snapped to attention and saluted when he walked by, and when he pulled on a flying suit and gave me my first flying lesson in a de Havilland Chipmunk, I was completely awestruck. Nowadays, it's my contention that we use the word hero much too casually. I was blessed to have known a real hero during my formative years, yet there are others living amongst us now, and most of us don't even realise it. One of them is in Onken. Laurie Lawrence flew Lancaster bombers, and this is his story. I started by asking why he'd volunteered for one of the most dangerous seats in World War II.
Well, it was the commencement of the last war and the bombing that took place in London and other cities. It was that caused me to suddenly realise that something had to be done, and my best friend and myself, we decided to join the Air Force.
Why the Air Force particularly? Why not join the Army or the Navy?
Because being 18 years of age, 19 years of age at that time, all we could think of was being fighter pilots. And that's what we joined up to be, fighter pilots.
How did you end up in bombers?
Because by the time I was called up, after volunteering, a period of 6 months passed by, and by that time the Battle of Britain had been fought and won. So fighter pilots were not required. When I was eventually called up in May 1941, and after my training on Tiger Moths, twin-engined airspeed Oxfords, and then on to Blenheims, I finished up in Bomber Command.
Where were you based?
Based on 12 Squadron, Wickham-B, Lincolnshire.
How long did it take to actually learn to fly the Lancaster?
It didn't take too long to fly the Lancaster because I did most of my flying on the Blenheim and the Wellington beforehand. And then we transferred from twin-engine to four-engine onto the Halifax. I did my initial training on the Halifax, so conversion to the Lancaster was very simple.
From the first time that you actually set eyes on a Lancaster bomber, how long did it take before you were able to actually fly it?
Well, I did 3 hours dual, and then I did my first solo, which took 35 minutes, solo landings.
So you were actually trained for about 3 hours on it?
On the Lancaster, yes.
And what was it like to fly compared to the other aeroplanes that you'd been flying up to that date?
But I always had one expression for the Lancaster. It's the Queen of the Sky. A beautiful aircraft, very easy on the controls. You could stand it on its wingtip, 2 engines cut on one side. A very manoeuvrable aircraft, an absolute dream to fly after the Halifax and the Wellington.
We have the benefit of hindsight now. We can look back on it. We know what happened in the war. We know what the results were. But at that time, it must have been terrifying to a young man like yourself, the very concept of getting into an aeroplane that was loaded with bombs and expected to fly thousands of miles.
Well, yes, of course, I had no idea of what to expect flying into enemy territory. But before we embarked on operations, from our heavy conversion unit, where we were training on these bombers, we had to do an exercise called a bullseye. And the bullseye was a rehearsal of doing an actual operation without going over enemy territory. On one occasion, with my crew, we were flying along the English Channel, horizontal to the enemy coast, which was the French coast at that time. And there was a hell of a lot of firing and activity going on over the French coast, which we hadn't seen before, of course. Looking at this, my engineer and myself and bomb aimer were quite excited about it. In the distance, we then called our navigator out from his little compartment and said, "Andy, come and have a look at this." Andy came out, looked at it, and went back into his compartment. And after about a couple of minutes, I said, "I think we need a new course, Andy, to set for somewhere like Plymouth." I can't remember the exact place now. And he didn't answer. I asked my bomb aimer to go back to see what was wrong with Andy, and then he came back, took off my headgear, and whispered in my ear, "He's shaking all over. He can't hold the pencil." To cut a long story short, the poor fellow just had this awful attack. It wasn't cowardice, it's just that he could not take it. My bomb aimer, who had also been trained as a navigator, was able then to take over the navigational duties. We flew back to our base, which then was with 100 Squadron at Waltham in Grimsby. And when we landed there, I had a good chat, of course, with my navigator, Andy, explaining to him what the situation would be, and suggested that he should have medical treatment and perhaps he could carry on flying with us. His attitude was, "Sorry, Skip, I am finished with flying. That's it. I never want to get into another aeroplane." So, of course, it meant that he was stripped of his sergeant's stripes and transferred into the army.
This wasn't any lack of moral fibre, it was just a complete physical and mental reaction to the stress.
Absolutely. And I think, quite honestly, I've read a lot about it since the last war, of course, and I think in a number of cases it was not cowardice. It was, as you've just pointed out, the nervous system being affected.
How did you cope with that? How did you cope with the nerves?
Well, the rest of the crew were okay, and I must say that as a pilot, it gives one, when one's in charge and has a small crew, you are responsible for the discipline in that aircraft. And that gave me a considerable amount of strength, being the pilot. There's no doubt about that.
Because the pilot was the skipper, wasn't he? He was in charge, whatever.
And I had to set an example.
But even so, even though there will have been propaganda, nowadays we call it spin, you will still have realised the chances of not coming back from a sortie.
Oh yes, well, we did realise that, of course, by hearing about all the raids that were taking place at the time we were training. It was always reported on the BBC, the targets that were hit and the number of aircraft that were missing as a result of those attacks. So we knew very, very well that we were risking our lives.
But how did you cope with it? Because I assume that most of your missions were night bombing missions. So to spend all day, then go out to the aeroplanes in the dead of night and to get into a bomber with thousands of pounds weight of bombs on board, which are dangerous enough, to take off and fly into Germany with enemy fighters attacking you with flak coming up from the ground. How did you prepare for the nerves and the sheer terror of that?
Well, because I'm 83 years of age now, so it's quite difficult for me to even recall how I felt in those days. But then I was 19, 20 years of age, and quite frankly, in our periods when we were not training or flying, if we could drink, we used to go out drinking. We always tried to court girls, of course, did all the things normally that an 18 or 19-year-old chap would do. The last thing we thought about was death.
Was there a lot of bravado involved? Did air crews not talk about the nerves?
Nobody could say that they were not frightened, but we didn't show it. We had to put on a certain amount of bravado.
How many missions were you expected to fulfil? You had a tour of duty, didn't you?
Well, I was operating in 1943. A tour of operations was expected to be 30, and on completion of 30 operations, then the whole of your crew, providing they'd been with you all the time, were posted to carry out instructional duties.
What were the chances of completing 30 bombing missions?
I think 30%.
Did you know that at the time, or was propaganda such that you thought you might all survive it?
No, we did know at the time because the losses were reported, not only through our own channels, intelligence channels, but the BBC every day after a raid was carried out by Bomber Command reported it and reported the casualties.
But one would assume that they underplayed the actual figures.
Sometimes they overplayed the figures, as a matter of fact. That did happen. But of course, what was not always taken into consideration was that quite a number of aircraft crashed on return. So they sometimes were not included in the figures. The figures that were aircraft, it always said aircraft missing. But sometimes there were several other fatalities.
You were the pilot, you were the captain, you were the skipper. Did that mean that you had to motivate the rest of the crew?
Yes, as the pilot and captain of the aircraft, I was responsible, of course, for our discipline, especially in the air. And being the skipper gave me a lot of confidence that I could get through and do what I had to do. And on one occasion, after we'd done 3 trips, my first 3 trips with the crew were Essen, Duisburg and Berlin. And at that particular time, they were 3 of the toughest targets that one could wish to visit. Losses occurred over those 3 targets. After coming back from Berlin, I always remember my navigator shortly after we landed saying to me, "Laurie, we've done 3 tough targets. We're going to get through this lot." His remarks turned out to be true.
Inevitably, with the odds of survival firmly against them, it wasn't to be long before Laurie and his crew faced the enemy at close quarters.
Yes, well, I had quite a number of problems on other raids, but one in particular was where I lost 2 of my gunners. We were detailed to lay mines in Gdynia harbour, which is just off Poland, of course. 9 of our aircraft set off from my squadron. I was half an hour behind the others because my aircraft, U for Uncle, went US, and I had to transfer to another one. And so I was half an hour behind the main stream. All the way over, we were flying low level across the North Sea and Denmark, and then we entered the Balkans and were subjected to heavy anti-aircraft fire from the coastal batteries. We laid our mines, and on the return I was shot up over Denmark, dawn breaking. My rear gunner spotted a Ju-88. He recognised it straight away as a Ju-88 coming, that is a fighter. I said to him, "Okay, Claire, you're in charge, give me the instructions." He said, "Prepare to dive port, prepare to dive port." And as he was said go, they'd opened up. I was in the act of turning. I saw the tracer pass complete, and I saw it go completely underneath. Blue streaks. Which later I found it was cannon, not normal machine gun bullets, it was cannon fire. There were screams immediately, of course, as we went into this dive from the rear gunner and the mid-upper gunner. We dropped down, I suppose, to about 6,000 feet. During that time I asked the flight engineer to give me a hand to pull the control column back. I couldn't understand why it would not come back. But he gave me a hand and we managed to right it. And as we righted it at about 6,000 feet, I relaxed on the control column and again the aircraft flipped over to port. And again, the engineer helped me, and by that time also, I had strong right rudder on, and I asked the bomb aimer to help me with the rudder. He was down in the front of the aircraft, and he pulled on the right rudder as well. Anyway, we managed to level out then at about 2,000 feet, and at that time I spotted a cloud and went straight into it. It was then, after we came out of the cloud, that we looked around, and I had the wireless operator in the Astrodome, and the engineer, bomb aimer, looking out, where is this damn fighter? We couldn't see it. We found out later, Claire, my rear gunner, did get a burst in, so we don't know whether we shot that fighter down. The reason Claire wouldn't know is he was blinded by the shrapnel from the cannon shell that went through part of his turret, and the mid-upper gunner was shot out of his seat and had a cannon shell go through his left knee. So the reason we didn't know whether we'd shot down that aircraft is because nobody had seen it shot down, and so we could not claim it. On the other hand, as I dived into that cloud, he might have just disappeared then. But it was at coming out of the cloud, I was then holding the control column completely over to starboard and complete right rudder, that we looked around and we discovered that our port aileron had been shot off. So with no port aileron, this is why the aircraft wanted to completely go over to port side all the time.
So how did you manage to get it back?
Well, by having full right rudder, full right control column over to starboard, and flying the aircraft like that. But of course we were slowly, very slowly, moving to port. I worked it out with the navigator that we would have to crash land somewhere south of our own base, that we could not possibly get back to Wickenby. And eventually, after about 2 hours flying, Norfolk came into view, and I recognised Coltishall. It was daylight then, of course, but the wireshaper called up and told that arranged for a crash landing. We didn't know whether the hydraulics were damaged or not, and we thought if they were, the undercarriage might not come down. I offered the crew a chance of bailing out if they wanted to before I attempted this landing, but they said, no, we're sticking with you, skipper, because we had 2 gunners, both injured. Before arriving just off Norfolk, of course, I'd arranged for the members of my crew to move the 2 gunners onto the bed which we had just behind the wireless operator, and they were injected with morphine to stop the pain and the screaming that had gone on. The navigator and the engineer did that between them. Anyway, coming back to the landing, I decided then that with the aid of the engineer helping me with his control column, and the bomb aimer, bless him, stayed in the nose of the aircraft and helped me with the rudder, that I would land the aircraft. Well, the first thing that happened, of course, was the undercart came down, and we were terribly relieved at least that was working. And then I went in with slightly fuller engine than normal, because I was scared that as soon as we touched down she was going to tip over to the left. But as it happened, going in on full throttle, and it was a grass aerodrome, we slowed down quite easily. I think I must have been a bit soft. And that was it.
You must have almost kissed the grass when you got out of the aeroplane.
Yeah. Well, of course, we saw the damage then, and the tail plane was badly damaged. Between the rear gunner and the mid-upper gunner's turret, there was a ghastly hole there on the side. We also found a cannon shell, which had not gone off, had hit the pitot head tank. It hadn't worked properly, but had just sort of burnt itself out. That was retained by my bomb aimer as a souvenir.
So you've just managed to scrape home. How soon was it before you were back in operations?
Well, we flew the next day. I flew back on the 29th, Coltishall to base, and then we were sent on leave, given a 48-hour pass, and then on the 12th of May, we did an operation to Duisburg.
It must have been terrifying, that particular flight. Was it difficult to motivate yourself and your crew to go up again after that?
Not really. I can't recall anyone else feeling uncomfortable or frightened. We were more concerned, actually, with the state of our gunners. And the first thing we asked when we got back, when can we go and visit them? I managed to persuade the squadron leader to let me take an aircraft down to Horsham St Faith. They gave us a car which took us to Norwich Hospital, and we saw our 2 gunners.
While you were going through all this, Did you really consider what you were bombing, or was it just a target? Were you bombing and killing people, or were you just looking for targets?
Now, as far as we were concerned there, we were bombing a target. Now, normally speaking, the intelligence officer, when he was giving his resume of the proposed raid, he would inform you of what the target might contain. For example, in the Ruhr, there was the Krupp's works at Essen. That was our main target. Duisburg, there were other targets. Each target selected usually had some reason for us bombing it. But admittedly, there were one or two which turned out to be the bombing of the population. Not intentional, but that happened, of course.
But some of it was intentional, wasn't it? Dresden, for example.
No, I don't think Dresden was intentional, but I don't know because I wasn't involved in that. But when you think on that one, the Americans went there more times than we did, dropped their bombs. Nobody ever mentions this. And they went in daylight when their bombing could have been more accurate, possibly, than bombing by night.
Since the end of the war, there has been a lot of criticism, though, of the work of Bomber Command in many ways. Do you think that that's justified? Do you think that that's fair?
I think it's very unfair.
Would you say that Bomber Harris was one of the heroes of the Second World War?
And in my opinion, he was a first-class hero. He motivated the aircrew, there is no doubt about that. Despite our horrendous losses, we all believed in him and we looked upon him as a first-rate commander.
And what was it about him that made you follow him so eagerly? Was it a belief in the rightness of the cause?
Well, I think so. I can only quote myself here, but having suffered the bombing of London from the Germans and how I felt being subjected to that, I agreed with Harris's outlook on all this, and I still say now to this day that had D-Day not occurred, we would have completed the end of the war by the bombing that we were then achieving at that stage. But of course, our bombing of these targets, so important to Hitler's arms industry, stopped immediately. D-Day landings occurred. Bomber Command then was converted to other targets. But had we maintained the program that Harris had set out, I think it would have shortened the war even more.
Did you continue flying after the war finished?
No. Actually, the end of the war, in a way, was a great disappointment. Not the end of the war was a disappointment. I was in Transport Command, and I'd been posted to a special flight for Sutton in Yorkshire. And on arrival there were no aircraft to start with, but when they did arrive, they were called Lancastrians. They were minus the rear turret and the mid-upper turret, and they were converted to carry passengers. And I was informed that my crew, which then consisted of myself, a navigator and a wireless operator, would be flying important people out to as far as Australia. Anyway, first flying I did there was an hour's instruction from a chap who'd done about 100 hours on Lancasters, and I'd done over 1,000 hours on 4 engines then. He thought it was amusing, but he had to obey orders. I subsequently did 3 hours more flying over a period of 4 months, and there was never any hint of flying anybody to Australia. I was then offered a short service commission, extended commission to my own commission. I was a flight lieutenant at the time, but I thought, if this is how the Air Force is operating, I'm spending most of my time drinking in local villages around the aerodrome, I asked to be moved.
The only thing that I can't understand is that after doing over 1,000 hours in a Lancaster as pilot in command of an aeroplane, which is some, I mean, I've never flown anything like a Lancaster, but I've flown Cessnas and light aircraft. It strikes me that it's something that kind of gets under your skin, flying aeroplanes, and I'm amazed that you've not wanted to do it since.
Well, I'll tell you why. Apart from the tragedy of just doing the 4 hours in about 4 months, going into Transport Command surprised me completely. The reason why I had instruction was that I must do rate 1 turns to port, rate 1 turns to starboard.
15-degree banks.
All that. I'd been used to throwing an aircraft around the sky. Even when I was instructing, if I wanted to, I could throw my Lancaster around the sky, cut engines, do what I wanted to do with it. In Transport Command, to me, I had to become a taxi driver. And it did not interest me at all.
You've not wanted to do it in just a light aircraft just for fun since then?
No, I was offered the chance, when they formed the Kenya Police Air Wing, I was offered the chance then of taking out my PPL and joining the Kenya Police Air Wing. And it would have been flying Cessnas. And I turned that down. I had no interest. I was much more interested in the CID that I was in at the time.
A lot's talk these days about heroes. Johnny Wilkinson, the rugby player, is a hero, and David Beckham's been a hero when he scored goals. How would you classify the blokes that you went through the war with?
Well, of course, as far as I'm concerned, if I may comment on this, all these people that you've just mentioned, albeit I rate Johnny Wilkinson as number one amongst the people you've just mentioned, all of them are overpaid, and as we used to say about the Yanks when they came over, overpaid, oversexed and over here. With these so-called stars now, they're not heroes as far as I'm concerned. They're people who have a certain ability and are being overpaid for that ability. They're certainly not heroes.
It's been said that war brings out the worst in people. Do you think it can also bring out the best in people?
That's a difficult one to answer because I'm trying to think how it affects me. Not being in touch with previous crew members or other members of the Air Force that I served with, I find that very difficult to really comment on. I hope that it's brought out the best in me, but I wouldn't know really. It's for other people to judge me on that.
And finally, if it was all to happen now, we've got the benefit of hindsight, we're looking back 60 years. If it was all to happen again now, do you think that the youth of today would respond in the way that you did in 1939?
Again, that's a difficult one to answer. I just have no idea how the youth of today would respond. All I can tell you is that as far as I was concerned, I served not only with the air crew but the ground crew as well in the Air Force with a wonderful set of blokes. Wonderful company, wonderful friends, and they did a job in lots of cases which they were not fully paid for.
Laurie Lawrence, a true hero, and another reason, if reason is needed, to support the annual Poppy Appeal. It's to people like Laurie that we owe our freedom, and at the going down of the sun, we must remember them.